When a wealthy father dies, his disabled daughter is cruelly cut out of the will while her siblings laugh. Branded bitter and greedy, Emma stays silent until a hidden video surfaces. What follows is a breathtaking unraveling of lies, betrayal, and long-buried truths. With courage and grace, Emma steps into a storm of public scrutiny, family warfare, and courtroom drama to claim what was always rightfully hers. But this isn't just a fight for an inheritance, it's a battle for justice, dignity, and a legacy no longer stolen. The final twist will leave you breathless. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that will be released soon. Rain pattered softly against the arched windows of the Lancaster estate, the rhythmic taps barely audible beneath the hum of tension that filled the mahogany-paneled room. The old grandfather clock ticked with ceremonial precision, its pendulum swinging like a metronome, counting down to a moment everyone had both anticipated and dreaded. In the center of the room, a long oval table gleamed under the golden light of a chandelier, its crystals refracting the stormy gray outside into fractured sparks of color. Around that table sat the heirs of Harold Lancaster, a titan of industry whose name still echoed through the corridors of corporate boardrooms and legacy columns. Blake Lancaster leaned back in his leather chair, exuding the ease of someone who had already calculated his share down to the dollar. His designer cufflinks caught the light each time he shifted, and every tap of his manicured fingers on the armrest echoed arrogance. Beside him sat Heather, their sister, her expression pinched behind a veil of practiced grief. She wore black, but the shade couldn't mask her boredom. Her eyes flitted from the massive oil portrait of their late father above the fireplace to the lawyer's leather briefcase on the table, practically vibrating with expectation. Across from them, Jeremy adjusted his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. The youngest of the favored three, he had always played middleman in family disputes, his loyalties guided by convenience. His eyes flickered toward the door, clearly waiting for someone he hoped wouldn't arrive. Then she did. Emma Lancaster entered the room quietly, her wheelchair gliding across the polished floor with a soft mechanical hum. Her caregiver held the heavy door for her before disappearing into the hallway, leaving Emma to face the wolves alone. Dressed simply in a dark cardigan and navy skirt, she didn't command the room the way her siblings did, but she didn't shrink from it either. Her presence was a surprise to some, a provocation to others. Well, Heather muttered under her breath as Emma approached the far end of the table. This should be entertaining. Blake didn't bother to hide his sneer. Didn't expect you to make the trip? Em thought stairs were your natural enemy. Emma ignored him, steering her chair to the last open space at the table. Her silence said more than any retort could. She met no one's eye, not even her mother's, especially not her mother's. Their mother, Eleanor Lancaster, sat like a monument to frost itself. Her lips were drawn in a thin line, her pearl earrings gleaming like judgment. She had offered Emma no greeting, not even a nod. The message was clear. You are tolerated, not welcomed. At the head of the table, Jonathan Greaves, the family's longtime attorney, cleared his throat. He looked older than Emma remembered, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he opened the thick envelope containing Harold's final will and testament. If everyone is ready, he said, his voice as dry as parchment, we shall begin. The room settled into silence. Outside, thunder growled distantly, as though the heavens themselves were reluctant witnesses. Emma sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart beat steadily, not from excitement or hope she had shed those years ago, but from bracing resolve. She had come for the truth, whatever shape it took. Jonathan unfolded the papers and began to read. The words filled the air like ceremonial incense, deliberate and final. Harold had not believed in shortcuts, even in death. To my beloved son, Blake, I leave 35% of my estate, including the holdings in Lancaster Development and the vineyard in Sonoma. Blake's smirk deepened. Emma watched the self-satisfaction curl around his features like smoke. To my daughter Heather, 25% of the estate, along with the penthouse in Manhattan and the Renoir. Heather didn't smile, but her fingers clutched the edge of the table just a little tighter. To Jeremy, 20%, and the beach property in Carmel. Jeremy exhaled, visibly relieved. He shot a quick glance toward Emma, then away. The air thickened. Emma felt her stomach clench, as the next words came. Words she could feel approaching like an oncoming tide. "And to my youngest daughter, Emma." "Lancaster." Greaves paused. Emma didn't blink. "I leave my enduring love and memories of our time together." A beat of silence followed. Then Heather snorted. Blake let out a low chuckle. "Well," he said, raising an eyebrow, "guess?" Dad finally saw through the pity act. Even Jeremy looked away, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Emma's chest tightened, but she didn't speak. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but her expression remained composed. The blow had been delivered with surgical precision. It wasn't. The lack of money that stunk it was the deliberate erasure. The public disowning of her place in the family, sealed and notarized. But Jonathan hadn't stopped reading. There was something else. And in that moment, Emma caught a brief glance from him, a subtle, almost imperceptible flash in his eyes. There was more, and it would change everything. Emma Lancaster remembered the last time her father had held her hand. It had been a spring afternoon, the garden in full bloom outside the solarium where they used to sit for hours. She had just turned 25, and her hands were still steady then, her legs still capable barely of bearing her weight with a cane. Harold had brought her tea in a porcelain cup, the way he always had, with a slice of lemon and 2 sugar cubes. He had knelt beside her wheelchair, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Don't let them make you small, Em. You see more clearly than any of them ever will." That moment had once felt like a shield. Now it felt like a ghost. 3 years had passed since then, 3 long, bitter years that unraveled everything she had once believed about family. And it had all started with one question, one that Harold never answered. Why had he stopped calling? Emma's condition, Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, had slowly but surely tightened its grip since her teens. The degeneration was slow but cruel. By her mid-20s, stairs had become mountains. Her once nimble fingers were now curled and cautious. And yet, Harold had never treated her like she was fragile. Not until the very end, not until the silence. Her siblings, on the other hand, had always seen her as the family embarrassment. They never said it outright, but Emma could feel it in their glances, in the way Blake would sigh when he had to wait for her to get in the car, or how Heather would roll her eyes if Emma needed help with her food. For them, her wheelchair was a symbol of inconvenience, something that didn't fit neatly into the Lancaster image. But Harold had been different. He had called her every week, even when his schedule was packed with shareholder meetings and global business trips. He had taken her to the theater, to museums, to garden centers, to buy herbs for the tiny windowsill. Boxers she loved. When the disease advanced and her world shrank, he had found ways to keep her included. That's why the change had cut so deep. It had started subtly. A missed phone call, a rescheduled visit. Then, suddenly, nothing. She was informed through a terse email from the family office that Harold was unavailable, that his health was delicate, that he was not to be disturbed. Emma had tried everything. Letters went unanswered. Calls routed straight to voicemail. Once she had even gone to the estate, only to be turned away at the gate. The staff who had once greeted her with warmth now looked at her with quiet discomfort. Rebecca Wu, her attorney and friend, had seen her through it all. She was the one who negotiated with landlords when Emma had to leave her accessible apartment in the city because her trust fund disbursements had mysteriously stopped. She was the one who helped Emma transition into a modest but clean 1-bedroom flat across town, where she now lived with a rotating schedule of caregivers. Her life had changed dramatically. Gone were the dinners at private clubs, the spa treatments. Her father used to book just because. Now her days were filled with routine medication schedules, physical therapy, government paperwork. She had adjusted, even learned to find a kind of peace in the quiet. But nothing could replace the aching question that kept her up at night. Why had he abandoned her? She hadn't wanted to attend the will reading. She'd almost said no. But when the letter arrived, written in Harold's unmistakable hand, requesting no, insisting that she be present, she felt something flicker inside her. A final clue, maybe. A last breadcrumb on the path to understanding. Now, after what had unfolded in that oak-paneled room, she was more confused than ever. He had left her nothing. No property, no money, not even the antique watch he once promised would be hers. The rest of the family had laughed, smug, victorious. But Emma had seen something they hadn't. The way Greaves had looked at her measured, careful, as if he were waiting for something, as if Harold's silence had been a setup, not a severing. Back in her apartment that night, Emma wheeled herself to the small table by the window and stared out at the city. The caregiver had gone home, hadn't called yet. The silence felt thick with something unspoken. She turned on the lamp and opened the small velvet pouch Greaves had discreetly passed her. After the reading, inside was a silver key and a note, folded once. Her father's handwriting stared back at her. "They will never understand, but you always did. Trust Rebecca. She knows where to look." Emma's heart pounded. She was no longer just the forgotten daughter. She was the one Harold had trusted with a secret. And it wasn't just about the money. It was about the truth. Jonathan Greaves held the parchment with care, as if the paper itself were heavy with the weight of legacy. The flickering fireplace behind him cast warm light across the room, illuminating the engraved crest of the Lancaster family, embossed on the will's thick cover. Around the table, Harold Lancaster's surviving family leaned forward like birds of prey, circling a feast, ready to consume whatever scraps the old man had left behind. Blake wore the same smug half-smile he'd arrived with, one hand swirling the amber in his tumbler, as if already toasting himself. Heather sat poised, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the document, like it was the final puzzle piece to a game she had long since won. Jeremy, more nervous than either of his siblings, picked at a hangnail, casting occasional glances toward Emma, who sat at the farthest end of the room in her wheelchair, silent and still. Jonathan cleared his throat. This will is dated 8 months prior to Harold Lancaster's passing. It was signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and notarized per state law. There have been no legally filed amendments since. He adjusted his glasses. Glancing briefly at Emma, something about the way his eyes lingered on her suggested this reading would not be what it appeared. Emma noticed. She straightened her spine and fixed her gaze on the table. "To my eldest son, Blake Lancaster," Jonathan began, his voice steady but formal. "I leave 35% of my estate, including full control of the vineyards. In Sonoma and the downtown corporate holdings in Chicago." Blake gave a small, victorious exhale and leaned back, arms folded. "Well, that's fair," he muttered under his breath, glancing at his siblings with theatrical modesty. Jonathan continued, "To my daughter Heather Lancaster, I leave 30% of my estate, the Manhattan penthouse and the Lancaster family art collection, including the original Renoir." Heather allowed herself a smile, restrained but satisfied. "As it should be," she said, brushing invisible lint from her blazer sleeve. "To Jeremy Lancaster, I leave 20% of the estate and the beach property in Carmel, as well as the European equity portfolio." Jeremy blinked, surprised. By the generosity, he nodded silently, a rare display of humility from a man usually eager for recognition. A pause. And finally, Jonathan said, his voice gentling slightly, "To my youngest daughter, Emma Rose Lancaster." The room seemed to hold its breath. Emma did not look up. Her fingers gripped the padded armrest of her chair. "I leave my deepest affection, fond memories of our time together, and the hope that she finds peace and strength in the life she continues to build." There was silence, brief and brittle. Then Heather gave a short, incredulous laugh. Blake didn't hold back. He burst into full laughter, slapping the table. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head. The old man finally saw through her sob story. "She gets love and hope," Heather added, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did he knit that into a scarf or something?" Jeremy shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Emma said nothing either. She did not flinch, did not cry. She simply stared at the candle flickering on the table beside her, its flame unsteady but alive. The burn in her chest was sharp, not just from the insult of being cut out, but from the finality of it all. Love and memories. That was what she had been left with. Not land, not money, not recognition. Just sentiment packaged in words that might have once meant something, but now felt like ashes. The air in the room was thick with smugness. Blake leaned back again, looking more king than heir. "Well," he said with a sigh, "glad we could all make time for this touching tribute." Jonathan, however, didn't join in the laughter. He closed the will carefully and placed it back into his briefcase, locking it with a soft click. Then he looked at Emma again. His face didn't show sympathiliers, rarely did, but something else. A glint, perhaps. A signal. Emma met his gaze. There was more. She could feel it. Harold Lancaster had never been a simple man, and if he had left her nothing, he had done so for a reason. Whether it was strategy, protection, or misdirection, she didn't yet know. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The room slowly emptied, the echo of mocking laughter still lingering in the thick air like smoke that refused to clear. The clink of crystal glasses murmured congratulations, and the sharp clicking of Heather's heels on marble floors faded down the corridor, swallowed by the grandeur of the Lancaster estate. Emma remained in her chair, motionless, her eyes fixed on the slowly dying fire in the hearth. The room had returned to silence, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows a blow. Jonathan Greaves gathered his papers with deliberate care, as though giving time to the moment, as though sensing she needed stillness to steady herself. His gray hands moved slowly, almost reverently, as he slid the will back into its envelope, snapped his briefcase shut, and finally straightened his blazer. Emma remained quiet, her body still tense with the invisible effort it took to seem unaffected. She could feel the pressure behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall here, not where Heather might glance back, or Blake might revel in the smallest crack in her composure. Greaves waited until the last echo of footfalls faded completely, then crossed the room and lowered himself to a crouch beside her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply rested one hand gently on the arm of her chair, grounding them both. His expression was unreadable calm, but not cold. "Miss Lancaster," he said softly, "your father left something else, privately." Emma's eyes shifted to meet his. There was no surprise in them, only the cautious spark of something older than hope, but only under specific conditions. He added. Her voice came out low, hoarse, as if drawn from deep within her chest. "What kind of conditions?" Greaves pulled a small envelope from inside his jacket pocket. It was cream-colored, sealed with a single strip of wax, and stamped with a modest version of the Lancaster crest. Her name, Emma Rose Lancaster, was written across the front in Harold's unmistakable cursive. "He left instructions that I deliver this to you after the reading, and only if you remained silent when the will was read aloud." Emma's eyebrows lifted, just slightly. "Silent," Greaves nodded, not objecting, not protesting, not speaking a word. It was his test, in a way. He believed that only if you accepted the humiliation with grace would you be ready to receive the truth. She exhaled sharply, almost a laugh. "And if I hadn't, then this would have stayed locked away, possibly forever." Emma stared at the envelope for a moment before slowly reaching for it. Her fingers, still stiff from her condition, struggled slightly to grasp the edge. Greaves didn't interfere. He simply waited until she took it from his hand. The wax seal was soft with age, the letter clearly written months ago. As she turned it over in her hands, her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if it was fear or vindication, perhaps both. Imagine your father expected today to unfold exactly the way it did. He was not a man who left much to chance. Emma didn't open the envelope yet. She held it to her chest, as if afraid its contents might change the moment she looked inside. "I don't understand," she said. "Why didn't he just say something before he died? Why not tell me?" "He believed he was protecting you," Greaves replied. "He mentioned that if he told you too soon, others might learn of it. That he needed to separate you from the rest of the family in the eyes of the world so that no one would suspect what he had truly left you." Emma's throat tightened. She swallowed hard. "And what did he leave me?" she asked, barely above. A whisper. Greaves rose slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his pants. "Not wealth," he said, "but something far more valuable. A truth your siblings would destroy to keep buried." He straightened his tie. "When you're ready, Miss Lancaster, call Rebecca Wu. She was your father's second executor for this part of the inheritance." Emma looked up sharply. "Rebecca knows she will. She's been waiting for your call, and she has what your father left behind." Greaves offered a small, respectful nod, then turned to leave. His footsteps echoed softly as he moved through the great hall, fading into silence once more. Emma sat alone again, but this time the weight in her hands carried more than shame. It carried possibility. The letter still unopened in her lap, She leaned back and exhaled slowly. Whatever came next, the game had just changed. The afternoon sun had begun to slant through the high windows of Rebecca Wu's modest office, casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. The space was elegant, but understated books neatly aligned on shelves, a single jade plant in the window, and a painting of a mountain lake behind the desk. Rebecca sat behind it, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, watching Emma with the intensity of someone accustomed to deciphering human puzzles. Emma shifted in her chair, the cushioned armrest of her wheelchair creaking slightly. The letter from her father sat unopened in her lap, still sealed in wax. She hadn't yet found the courage to read it. She had come here straight from the estate, the weight of the will reading still pressing into her chest like a bruise. Rebecca was patient. She had always been patient with Emma Fierce, unyielding in court, but calm in moments like these. She reached across the desk and poured a small cup of jasmine tea, sliding it toward Emma without a word. It steamed gently between them. "I don't understand what's happening," Emma said finally. "Greaves handed me the letter, said my father left something private, and that only you would know where to look. But he wouldn't explain." Rebecca's gaze flickered, as if confirming a suspicion she had long harbored. She turned to the small safe beneath her desk, keying in a code with swift, practiced fingers. The door opened with a soft click, and from it she withdrew a small black USB drive. A white label was affixed to one side, marked with a single phrase in Harold Lancaster's meticulous handwriting: "Play only if challenged." She held it delicately between thumb and forefinger, then placed it on the desk in front of Emma like a detonator. "Your father came to me 6 months before he died," Rebecca said. "He told me he no longer trusted the channels around him, not his board, not his assistants, and certainly not your siblings. He believed they would contest anything that wasn't in their favor." Emma furrowed her brow. "Contest what? He left me nothing. There's nothing to challenge." Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tapped the USB stick. This was his contingency plan. He didn't want to leave everything out in the open. He said the estate would be contested, manipulated, if the true contents of his intentions were known too early. "But he said in the will that he was leaving me love and memories," Emma said, her voice edged with frustration. "He let them humiliate me in front of everyone." "No," Rebecca said gently. "He let them reveal themselves." Emma stilled. Rebecca continued. "He knew what they would do, that Blake would gloat, that Heather would mock you. He expected their arrogance. He planned for it, but he needed it documented, witnessed. That's why the will was left as it was. The real terms were buried legally and only triggered if your siblings acted in bad faith." Emma stared at her. "Bad faith?" Rebecca nodded. "If they celebrated your exclusion, if they displayed malicious intent, if they revealed their true motivations publicly." Emma shook her head in disbelief. "That can't be legal. It's rare, but it's binding. A sealed clause preconditioned on behavior. And today, you witnessed it unfold exactly as he said it would. Blake, Heather, Jeremy, they proved your father right." Rebecca pushed the USB stick closer. "Play this if the family challenges the terms. That's what he told me. But he meant more than that. He meant, play this if they reveal themselves for who they are." Emma picked up the drive, her fingers trembling slightly. "What's on it?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "I was told not to view it. Only you can decide whether we watch it together or not. But your father was very clear. Once the truth is out, there's no going back. Everything changes." Emma turned the small black device over in her palm. It was unremarkable in appearance, something anyone might carry on a keychain or toss in a drawer. Yet it weighed heavy, thick with implication. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Then let's find out." Rebecca nodded once, powered on her secure laptop, and inserted the USB into the port. The screen flickered, and a single video file appeared. Emma_final.mp4. The cursor hovered above the file with a click. The past began to speak. The moment the video loaded, Emma felt a slow burn begin in her chest, a sensation. Not quite pain, but close, as though something long dormant had stirred. But she didn't press play yet. Not yet. Her eyes remained fixed on the glowing file name, while her mind drifted, pulled back through time like a tide dragging her to the shore of memory. It hadn't always been like this. There had been laughter once, family dinners in the dining room, of the estate, where Harold would pour wine into crystal glasses and offer each of his children a toast Blake for his achievements in the business, Heather for her carefully curated social image, Jeremy for being the peacekeeper, and Emma, for her mind, her insight, her quiet courage. Her father had admired her most for her ability to see through facades, for her calm intelligence. That was what made his eventual silence hurt more than anything. The idea that even he had come to believe the lies spun by those who saw her as inconvenient. It had started innocently enough, she thought. Just a late-night conversation in the study 2.5 years ago. She'd rolled her chair up to Harold's desk, her fingers brushing against a folder she wasn't meant to see. Numbers, graphs, charts. She remembered the gnawing unease. In her gut, it wasn't just that the figures didn't add up, it was that someone had tried to make them appear as though they did. "Dad," she'd said softly, "something's wrong with the numbers from Q3. These profit margins are artificially inflated." Harold had blinked at her. "You're sure? I ran them through my accounting software." "Someone's shifting funds between shell accounts. I think it's coming from within the family office." He hadn't dismissed her then. In fact, he'd looked disturbed. He'd closed the folder, nodded gravely, and kissed her on the forehead. "Thank you," he'd said. "I'll take care of it." But taking care of it had turned into something else entirely. Within a week, she noticed a shift. Calls went unanswered. Her invitation to the quarterly board dinner was lost in the mail. Her name was quietly removed from access to the company's financial dashboard, even though she had been given honorary oversight years ago. Then came the confrontation. Heather had arrived at her apartment unannounced, furious, barely concealing the venom behind her words. "How dare you accuse us of fraud?" Heather had snapped. "Dad told us everything. You're trying to start a war over a spreadsheet. What is this? Your way of staying relevant?" Emma had been stunned. "I didn't accuse you. I saw something wrong and I thought he should know. That's all." "Oh, please," Heather hissed. "You've always played the victim, hiding behind your condition like it makes you some sort of oracle. You don't belong in the company. You never did." Those words, she remembered, had felt like a slap. Not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed something she'd always feared, that no matter how much she contributed, how much she cared, she would always be viewed as fragile, incapable, expendable. The weeks after were a blur. Jeremy stopped calling. Blake made a show of removing her from the family's charitable advisory board, citing a need for able-bodied leadership. Even Harold, once so attentive, stopped responding altogether. It was as if she'd become invisible, or worse, an enemy. Then the trust payments had stopped. The caregiver hours were cut in half. The accountant claimed new legal restructuring, and there was nothing she could do without initiating an ugly legal battle she didn't have the resources to fight. And through it all, she'd waited for Harold to come to his senses, to call, to visit, to ask her what had happened. But he never did until today, she thought. Glancing at the unopened letter in her lap and the glowing USB video on Rebecca's laptop, the silence had been strategic. The betrayal had been calculated. The family had rewritten the story while she'd been locked out of the room. But now she had the key. Emma looked up at Rebecca, who was watching her carefully, waiting for the signal. She reached forward, her hand hovering over the mousepad, and pressed play. Let the truth speak. The next morning, Rebecca sat alone at her kitchen table, a steaming mug of green tea between her hands and the soft clack of rain on the window panes. Setting the tone for the day ahead, her laptop was open, casting a cool blue light on her tired features as she scrolled through archived personnel records and LinkedIn profiles. The name she searched for wasn't common, but there were still too many Gloria Carsons in the state. She narrowed the search. Formerly employed by Lancaster Holdings, personal assistant to Harold Lancaster, then she found her. Gloria M. Carson, now in her early 60s, had retired quietly just over a year ago. No social media presence, no current employer, just a listing with an old landline number in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Rebecca copied down the address and closed the laptop. Something about the look in Harold's eyes in that video kept playing in her mind, an urgency that hadn't faded with time. A final confession wrapped in something larger, and if what Emma suspected was true, then Gloria might be the only living person who knew the full extent of what Harold had discovered in his final months, The neighborhood was quiet, the kind where wind chimes danced in the breeze and porch swings creaked in slow rhythm. Rebecca found the house easily a small, pale blue bungalow with white shutters and a well-tended garden out front. She rang the bell, half expecting no one to answer. But after a moment, the door opened a crack. "Yes," said a voice, soft and guarded, double quotes, "Ms. Carson?" Rebecca asked, holding out a business card. "I'm Rebecca Wu. I'm a lawyer. I'm working with Emma Lancaster." The door paused, then opened wider. "Emma," Gloria repeated, blinking. Her eyes were a tired green, ringed with age and experience, but something softened when she said, "The name, come in." The living room was warm, filled with the faint scent of lavender and worn upholstery. Gloria moved slowly, her knees stiff, as she lowered herself into a cushioned armchair. She gestured for Rebecca to take the love seat across from her. "I haven't heard that name in a long time," Gloria said. "Not since ... well, not since before Harold passed. How is she?" "She's holding together," Rebecca replied. "Barely." "Yesterday was the reading of the will." Gloria nodded solemnly. "Let me guess. The other three got everything, and Emma got ... nothing." "Just his love and memories," Rebecca said, the bitterness in her voice unmistakable. Gloria closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her fingers to her temple. "That man," she murmured. "He waited too long." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "Did he ever talk to you about making changes?" "To the will?" Gloria gave a small, sad laugh. "Every week for the last 3 months of his life, he'd found out things that hurt him deeply. He didn't say how exactly, but it had to do with company finances. Said someone maybe, more than one, was siphoning money, using shell corporations, making side deals that he hadn't authorized. At first, he thought it was a mistake. But Emma ... She paused. "Emma brought it to his attention, didn't she?" Rebecca nodded. "She did. I thought so," Gloria whispered. "He always trusted her, always said she was the only one who didn't want anything from him except the truth. Then, why didn't he change the will?" Rebecca asked. "He tried," Gloria said quietly. "He called me into his office a week before he was hospitalized. Asked me to arrange a meeting with his estate lawyer, someone else, not Greaves. He didn't trust anyone tied to the company anymore. He was going to restructure everything, put Emma in control of the foundation, and reduce the other shares. Not cut them out, but enough to make them answer for what they did. But the meeting never happened. 2 days later, he collapsed at home. Stroke, they said. Rebecca's heart sank. So the changes were never signed." "No," Gloria replied. "But he did make notes, typed up a rough draft. I printed it out for him. He kept it in his desk drawer." Rebecca frowned. "The desk in the estate study?" "Yes. They said it had already been cleared out," Rebecca said, voice darkening. Gloria gave a knowing look. "Then they found it, and they buried it, just like they tried to bury her." Silence fell between them. "I knew he didn't forget her," Gloria whispered. "I knew it." Rebecca stood slowly, her voice steady. "If you can write a sworn statement, I'll make sure it's heard. I promise you that." Gloria met her gaze, something fierce rising behind her tired eyes. "I'll do more than write one. I'll testify." As Rebecca stepped back out into the soft rain, she glanced down at the folder Gloria had handed her, a printout of the rough draft Harold never had the chance to sign. At the top, in bold revised estate terms, Emma Lancaster, trustee of the Lancaster Family Foundation. The will wasn't just unfinished, it had been stolen. Rebecca didn't go straight home after leaving Gloria's bungalow. Instead, she parked outside the Lancaster estate, just beyond the iron gates, staring at the sprawling mansion that loomed like a fortress on the hill. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The headlights cast long shadows across the stone driveway, illuminating the lion statues that flanked the grand entrance. Somewhere inside, behind one of those upper windows, was the study Harold's study room Gloria had spoken of with such certainty. He kept a backup of everything in there, Gloria had said. His notes, correspondence, financials. He called it his vault without locks. Said if anything ever happened to him, the truth would survive in that room. But that vault had been sealed shut the moment Harold's body was removed from the estate. Within hours, Blake had taken charge. Rebecca had read the emails herself, printed copies provided by Gloria from Harold's archived accounts. The ones that proved Blake had notified the staff and lawyers alike that the study was to remain untouched until after the estate was settled. Settled, in Blake's language, meant stripped clean. Rebecca had walked these halls before, years ago. When she handled one of Harold's philanthropic contracts, she remembered the layout wealthy grand staircase, the east corridor that led to the study, and the heavy oak door that bore a brass placard engraved with Harold's initials. It had always been his sanctuary. No one entered without permission. Now, it was a tomb. The next morning, Rebecca filed the necessary motions at the county courthouse. She knew she'd be met with resistance. Blake would argue obstruction, claim privacy rights, do everything in his power to delay. But she also knew how to work the law. She didn't file under estate matters. Instead, she filed under the legal right of Emma Lancaster to secure potential evidence relating to a disputed trust, supported by a sworn affidavit from Gloria Carson. Took 3 days for the emergency hearing to be granted. Blake didn't bother to show up in person. His legal team did the talking for him, citing privilege, privacy, and chain of custody concerns. But the judge was old school and meticulous. The affidavit carried weight. More importantly, Rebecca presented the sealed USB footage, Harold's own voice, his own warnings. That, more than anything, turned the tide. The room is sealed. Not destroyed, the judge had said. If there's documentation inside that affects the administration of the will, then Ms. Lancaster has the right to examine under supervision. Rebecca returned to the estate with a court order in hand. She was greeted not by Blake, but by the estate manager, a stiff man named Collins, who looked as if someone had ordered him never to smile. His mouth twisted slightly when she showed him the document. He made a show of reading it twice before finally unlocking the door to the east wing. The study was exactly as Rebecca remembered. Dustier, dimmer, but intact. The scent of leather-bound books and wood polish still hung faintly in the air, mingled now with the fainter traces of something long undisturbed. The curtains were drawn, muting the morning light, and the desk sat in the center like an altar. Its surface was pristine, but that in itself was suspicious. Harold had always kept it organized, but never empty. Rebecca moved slowly, her eyes scanning the room. She took photographs of everything before touching a thing. The bookshelves were intact, the framed photographs untouched. But it was the desk drawer Gloria had mentioned that drew her focus. She slid it open, and there, nestled beneath a stack of innocuous stationery, was a thin leather folder. Inside were pages marked in Harold's handnotes, titled Amendments to Primary Will, not signed. The writing was precise, listing new allocations, including a full 40% of the estate placed in trust under Emma's name. With controlling interest in the Lancaster Foundation, Rebecca's breath caught. Tucked behind the papers was a flash drive. It bore no label, only a single sticky note with Harold's handwriting. For Emma, in case they silence me. Rebecca stood still for a long moment, the weight of what she was holding pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just a backup. It was a last stand. A man's attempt to outwit the very people he knew would betray him. She turned to Collins, whose face had paled slightly. "I need this copied. Twice, and secured. You'll get a copy for the court. I'll keep one for my client." Collins hesitated. "Miss Wu, ... I didn't know. I didn't think." Rebecca's voice cut like glass. "You weren't paid to think. You were paid to obey. That ends today." As she stepped back into the hallway, the door to the study slowly clicked shut behind her. The truth had waited long enough. Now, it was ready to speak. The courtroom was colder than Emma expected, despite the summer heat outside. The heavy wooden benches, the sterile walls. The dispassionate gaze of the judge, it all felt designed to strip emotion from a place born out of conflict. Her hands resting in her lap trembled faintly, though not from fear. It was the anticipation, the weight of everything coming to a head after years of silence and months of discovery. She sat beside Rebecca at the plaintiff's table, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a simple pearl brooch that had once belonged to her grandmother. Across the aisle sat her siblings, flanked by an army of expensive-looking attorneys in tailored suits. Blake looked smug, tapping something into his phone. Heather wore oversized sunglasses indoors like some fallen Hollywood star, while Jeremy looked nervous, eyes darting between his siblings and the judge's bench, as though still unsure whose side he was on. The case was officially filed under Emma Lancaster v. the estate of Harold F. Lancaster, ETH, but everyone knew what it was about: power, money, and the question of whether a daughter cast aside without a dime could force the world to listen to her version of the truth. Rebecca stood, her presence immediately commanding. "Your Honor, we are filing this suit on the grounds of breach of fiduciary responsibility and will manipulation, supported by documented testimony from a former estate staff member, sworn affidavits, and, most importantly, an unsigned amended draft of Mr. Lancaster's final intentions. We contend that the version of the will read to this court and to the beneficiaries does not reflect his actual final wishes." Before the judge could even respond, one of the opposing attorneys rose smoothly. His name was Whitman Vale, partner from a prestigious Manhattan firm, and he oozed condescension with every syllable. "Your Honor," he began with a smile, "this is nothing more than a desperate attempt by the plaintiff to rewrite a will that simply didn't favor her. Mr. Lancaster had ample opportunity to finalize changes if he wished. The will in question is legally binding, fully witnessed, and notarized. The rest, this so-called draft, mounts to hearsay and wishful thinking." Blake stifled a laugh behind his hand. Heather whispered something to Jeremy, who nodded absently. Still avoiding eye contact with Emma. The judge raised a hand to quiet the room. "I will remind both sides that the court has not yet ruled on admissibility. We will hear preliminary motions and examine the plaintiff's submitted materials." Outside the courtroom, the story was already spinning out of control before they'd even arrived at the courthouse. Headlines blared from phone screens and newsstands. "Bitter daughter launches legal war over father's will. Disabled heiress demands fortune she was denied. Lancaster family feud erupts in courtroom drama." Social media was worse. Comment sections were filled with cruel speculation. People who had never met her, who had no idea who she was, were calling her manipulative, greedy, entitled. Some suggested she was being used by opportunistic lawyers. Others mocked her disability, as if her wheelchair somehow disqualified her from having agency. Emma tried not to read them, but it was impossible to avoid entirely, even when she turned off her phone. The headlines screamed at her from strangers' lips, from the scrolling banners in coffee shops and waiting rooms. What hurt most wasn't the strangers, it was the silence from those who should have known better. Former friends, extended family. Not one message, not a single word of support. Back in the courtroom, Rebecca was laying out their timeline. The draft revision included redistributions that placed 40% of Mr. Lancaster's holdings into a trust in my client's name, Vale cut in, which was never signed. Rebecca didn't flinch, because he was incapacitated 2 days later and died shortly thereafter. That does not invalidate the pattern of behavior and the corroborating witness testimony. The judge held up a hand again. "Ms. Wu, Mr. Vale, you've both made your preliminary arguments. I will review the materials provided and determine the scope of discovery. For now, the case remains open. We will reconvene in 2 weeks." The gavel struck once. The tension broke like a snapped wire. Emma exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for months. She looked over at Blake, who met her gaze and offered a slow, mocking clap before turning and walking out. Outside the courtroom, the reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Microphones extended. "Emma, are you contesting your father's love? Is this about the money or revenge? Were you really disinherited for cause?" Rebecca blocked the path and waved them off, shielding Emma from the worst of it. But the damage had already been done. In the court of public opinion, she was on trial too, not for what she was doing, but for daring to speak at all. And yet, somewhere inside her, beneath the bruises of ridicule and the fear of what still lay ahead, there was a steel core forming. The courtroom wasn't her battlefield. Truth was, and she wasn't backing down. The envelope arrived quietly, tucked among legal documents and financial disclosures Rebecca had requested during discovery. It was a routine item in a stack of less than routine paperwork, a thin manila sleeve marked simply "Property Transfer Confirmation." At first glance, it seemed trivial. A modest, low-value property on the outskirts of town, half an acre. A single-story brick house nearly swallowed by ivy. Its appraised value barely a blip on the Lancaster estate's radar. The tax records showed it had been in Harold's name for years, but never mentioned in any estate meeting. never included in his public holdings. Rebecca squinted at the details. The property had been quietly reassigned to Emma 2 days before Harold's stroke. No legal fanfare, no trustee involvement, just a direct transfer. No mortgage, no liens, no note in the will. When she handed Emma the envelope, the younger woman stared at it as though it might be a mistake. "I've never heard of this place," she murmured, turning over the address in her mind. "Why would he transfer this to me?" "I don't know," Rebecca said, "but it happened before he fell ill, which means he wanted you to have it deliberately." Emma brushed her thumb over the corner of the page. The name of the street struck no familiar chord. It was just a quiet little house in a part of town, known more for rusted-out trucks and sagging porches than multi-million-dollar legacies. They decided to visit it together. The drive took nearly an hour. The neighborhood grew more sparse as they traveled, the buildings farther apart, the signs of wealth thinning until all that remained was an old gas station, a diner with a flickering sign, and a post office that looked more like a tool shed. When they finally turned onto the gravel road listed in the deed, Emma felt a strange chill. The house emerged from behind a screen of old trees, small and almost forgettable. The brick was worn, ivy growing across the chimney like veins. The front gate was unlocked. They parked beneath an overgrown oak tree. Rebecca helped Emma from the car, her chair bumping slightly over the uneven path as they made their way toward the door. There was no security system, no sign of forced entry, no furniture visible through the dusty windows. But when Rebecca turned the key one, Harold had slipped into a separate envelope labeled, "Keep this safe." The lock clicked open smoothly, as if the door had been waiting for them. Inside, the air was cool and dry, faintly musty, but well-preserved. The front room was empty save for a desk, a battered filing cabinet, and a single floor lamp that didn't work. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, except for the filing cabinet's top drawer, which had clearly been opened and closed recently. That alone made Rebecca pause. They began exploring, the quiet settling over them like a blanket. The living room led to a small hallway with 2 closed doors. The first opened to a bare bedroom, the walls stripped of decoration. But the second door revealed the true purpose of the house. The room was small, windowless, and reinforced from within. Along the walls were metal shelves filled with labeled boxes, legal correspondence, board minutes 2003 to 2018, personal journals, unfiled research notes. Each folder was dated, organized, and carefully sealed in plastic sleeves. On a low table near the back wall sat an old but well-maintained video camera, several hard drives, and what appeared to be reels of analog film. It wasn't a panic room, it was a vault. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she moved closer to the journals. She recognized her father's handwriting, instantly clean, precise, underlined with control. She picked up one dated just 3 months before his death. Inside, he'd written, "They won't let me change the will, not without delay. I can feel them circling. If you find this, Emma, then it means I was right to be cautious." Rebecca said nothing as she crouched beside the filing cabinet, scanning labels. There were documents here that tied together everything: the hidden financial discrepancies, the redacted board meetings, the communications between Blake and a shadowy, private accountant based in the Caymans. This wasn't a backup archive. This was Harold's Plan B. Why here? Emma asked aloud, more to herself than anyone else. Why not a safe deposit box? Why not give this to someone? Rebecca closed one of the drawers with a soft thud. Because here, it was forgotten. And forgotten meant safe. He left it to you because he knew no one else would think to look for, except the one person who knew the difference between truth and loyalty. Emma wheeled herself toward the shelves, her eyes scanning title after title. Tucked in the far corner was a box labeled Video Testimony. She opened it, hands trembling. Inside were 4 unmarked USB drives, 2 cassette tapes, and a yellow sticky note with Harold's unmistakable writing, in case they tried to erase me. Show them who I was. Emma looked up, her voice low and steady. We have everything we need now. Rebecca nodded. Then it's time to burn down their lies. The sun had dipped low by the time Emma and Rebecca returned to the apartment, casting long amber beams across the floor. The box of labeled drives sat on the coffee table, a stark contrast to the cozy quiet of the living room, Emma's hands. hovered above the collection, choosing one marked with a yellow sticker that read simply, June 3rd Final Draft. There was something unshakable about the way it was labeled, as though Harold had known exactly when the end would come. Rebecca connected the USB to her laptop, the screen coming to life in the soft dusk. A single file appeared, hl-testimony-final.mp4. She clicked play. The image flickered, settling into the grainy but stable frame of Harold Lancaster, sitting alone at the small desk in the very house they'd just left. He wore a dark navy sweater, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a half-empty glass of scotch beside him. His usually immaculate hair was a little disheveled, and his eyes, always sharp and commanding, were tired, but not weak. He looked directly into the camera. "If you're watching this," he began, his voice rough but deliberate, "it means my children, my first three, the ones who bore my name with pride but little honor, have done exactly what I feared they would." Emma sat up straighter, her breath catching in her throat. Harold leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. "Blake, Heather, Jeremy. I always knew ambition ran in our blood. I celebrated it, I fed it, but I was wrong. Somewhere along the way, I taught them to value power more than truth, control more than compassion, and now they've taken that lesson and used it to destroy the one person who never asked for anything except honesty, my daughter Emma." The silence in the room deepened. Emma stared at the screen, transfixed. "I suspect," Harold continued, "that they have already read my will. The version they believe is final. I wrote it under pressure, under manipulation. I knew I was being watched, my communications intercepted. I couldn't trust anyone, not even the people I once considered loyal, so I played along." He reached beneath the desk in the video, pulling out a folder, the same kind they had found in the hidden property. "But I created this Plan BA, second record, protected, hidden, of a crumbling empire, but to pass along truth, the kind of truth this family has spent generations burying." He opened the folder and held up a copy of the revised estate plan, his fingers shaking slightly. "This document," he said, "was never signed. They made sure of that, but it reflects my intent. 40% of the Lancaster estate to Emma in trust, with full oversight of the family foundation. The rest adjusted to reflect actual contributions. And accountability, it was meant to correct the imbalance. Not punish, but ensure integrity." He set the folder down gently and looked back into the lens. "Emma, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry I didn't do more. I thought I had time. I thought I could protect you without putting you in harm's way. But I realize now that protection without truth is just another form of control." Emma blinked rapidly, her chest tightening. "You were always the one who saw through things, the only one who looked past the surface, past the privilege. I'm not proud of how this family has handled your strength. I allowed their resentment to fester, thinking it would pass. But it didn't, and I failed you in that." Harold paused, then took a sip of scotch, his hand visibly shaking. "This testimony, the documents, the journals, they're yours now. Use them wisely. Share them if you must. Just know that they come with a warning. Blake won't give up easily. Heather will spin a story faster than any media outlet could hope to contain. And Jeremy? He'll follow whichever current pulls him. But none of them have what you do." He leaned closer to the camera, his expression solemn. "If they challenge you, fight. If they slander you, stand tall. Because truth always outlasts the storm. And when the wind dies down, only those rooted in something real will remain standing." The screen faded to black. Emma sat in silence, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The words she had longed to hear were now etched in time, not as consolation, but as confirmation. Her father had seen everything, understood everything, and had still chosen her even if he'd done so too late to say it in person. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice low. "We need to get this in front of the court." Emma nodded slowly, her voice barely audible, and the world, the hours after, watching the video blurred into a quiet whirlwind. Neither Emma nor Rebecca said much. The weight of Harold's words still lingered in the room like the scent of something burning mysticable. Harold hadn't only left behind a message, he'd left a weapon. And now they were holding it. Rebecca spent the next morning cataloging the files from the USB drives found at the hidden property. She sat hunched over her laptop, her fingers dancing over keys with methodical intensity. Harold had saved more than just a testimony. He'd archived proof thousands of files, neatly organized into folders labeled confidential, internal correspondence, and audit trail. Most damning of all was the folder labeled Final Amendment. Inside were scanned copies of spreadsheets, balance sheets, wire transfers each, time-stamped, each pointing to inconsistencies in the Lancaster Company's financial records. Rebecca cross-checked them with public filings. The differences were subtle but deliberate. Funds redirected into shell corporations. Consulting fees paid to entities owned by Blake and Heather. Donations listed under Jeremy's name that never reached the charities, and there was more. Harold had used a voice recorder, his old one, with a tape so worn its label had half faded. On it, he chronicled his descent into suspicion, and eventually, clarity. Rebecca played the first tape while Emma listened silently, hands folded in her lap. "They think I don't notice," Harold's voice rasped from the speakers. Blake moves funds under the guise of market repositioning. Heather uses the family foundation like it's her personal purse. Jeremy, God help him, is too weak to stand up to either of them. And Emma, she told me, she warned me, and I didn't listen. Emma's face was pale, her lips parted slightly as if bracing herself. I believed Blake when he said Emma was confused. I believed Heather when she told me Emma was trying to sow division. I even entertained the idea that Emma wanted more than she was owed. But now I know they lied, and I let them. A pause, a heavy exhale, the sound of ice clinking in a glass. I saw the figures with my own eyes last month. Emma was right. Her analysis was flawless, and the moment I confronted Blake, he backpedaled with the charm I now see was practiced. Heather cried and said, "Was losing my mind." Jeremy wouldn't even meet my eyes. Another long silence. That's when I knew they weren't just greedy. They were dangerous. Not in the way that makes headlines, but in the way that hollows out legacies and calls. It business as usual. And I, for too long, helped build the pedestal they now stand on. Emma turned her face away, but not before Rebecca saw the tears starting again. There was no shame in them, only the hollow ache of vindication delayed too long. The second file. In the Final Amendment folder was a typed unsigned document. At the top, supplemental addendum to last will and testament of Harold F. Lancaster. It outlined new terms. 40% of the estate to be placed into a trust for Emma, with full control of the Lancaster Foundation. The remaining 60% was to be redistributed equally among the other children, contingent on their cooperation with a forensic audit. It was bold, it was ironclad in intent, even if never made legal through signature. In the margins, Harold had left handwritten notes. Emma is the only one who understands stewardship. Do not let the board override her judgment. Add clause protecting public transparency. Rebecca looked up. He meant for this to be permanent. This wasn't just a draft. He was working out how to make this stick, and they knew it. They stopped him, Emma said quietly, voice brittle. He started this, and they made sure he didn't finish. But now we will, Rebecca said, her tone sharpening. This is the smoking gun, Emma. The financial evidence, the recordings, the written amendments, no judge will ignore this. They manipulated the will, and you have every right to challenge it. Not as someone fighting for scraps, but as the rightful heir to your father's legacy. Emma closed her eyes. Her fingers brushed over the corner of the amendment, as if touching it could connect her to the man who had finally seen her not as weak, not as broken, but as worthy. It wouldn't undo the years of isolation or the betrayal that had torn her family apart. But it was a beginning, a reckoning, and the truth, at last, was loaded and ready. It began with a phone call. Rebecca had made it quietly, without fanfare. From her office in the early hours of the morning, when the streets were still empty and the air heavy with the stillness of anticipation. She had chosen her contact carefully, Elena Ruiz, a seasoned investigative journalist known for her integrity and instinct for stories that mattered. Elena wasn't a tabloid hunter or a gossip columnist. She was the kind of reporter who listened, who waited, and who knew how to separate scandal from substance. Rebecca had only said one sentence, before the pause that changed everything. Have footage of Harold Lancaster admitting he was coerced into leaving his disabled daughter out of his will. Elena didn't ask for more. She only asked when they could meet. By noon that same day, a 3-minute clip of Harold's final video had gone live on the Clarion's website. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, direct. It showed Harold sitting in that dim room, his voice tired but unshakable, saying the words that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. "If you're watching this, it means my children betrayed my last wishes, and my daughter Emma deserves the truth." Those 16 seconds, played on loop, were enough to shift the ground beneath the entire narrative. Within an hour, #JusticeForEmma trended across social platforms. News anchors, who had once peddled the story of a greedy, bitter daughter, now stumbled over themselves to reframe their coverage. Pundits who had scoffed at her lawsuit were now speculating about how deep the corruption in the Lancaster family ran. Screenshots of the video flooded timelines, paired with captions like "The forgotten daughter speaks loudest" and a father's final confession. Elena's article followed soon after, comprehensive, measured, and devastating. It outlined the timeline of events, the discovery of the secret property, the evidence of financial manipulation, and the detailed transcripts from Harold's recordings. It stopped short of publishing all the data, but it left no doubt that Emma had been telling the truth all along. Emma sat in her apartment, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in her eyes, watching the video that had once made her cry now move millions. The air around her buzzed with notifications, emails, messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some were apologies, others were support. A few were still cruel. But the tide had turned. Across town, Blake's phone buzzed incessantly. He silenced it with increasing fury, his knuckles white as he read the headlines. Heather had gone dark. No calls, no interviews, no social media. And Jeremy, always the weakest, had reportedly already contacted a different attorney. Cracks were forming. Rebecca entered the apartment with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that flickered between pride and exhaustion. "They've requested an interview," she said, setting the cups down. "Elena wants to speak with you. Directly, she thinks people should hear from you in your own words." Emma hesitated, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. "I'm not sure I'm ready." Rebecca sat across from her. "You don't have to be polished. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be real." That's what Harold wanted, and that's what people are seeing now. The real story, not the spin. Emma looked back at the screen. The comments kept pouring in. "My father did the same thing." "Thank you for fighting. This made me cry." "You're not alone." "They tried to erase you, but now we see you." Her voice was soft. "It's strange. I've been invisible for so long, and now suddenly everyone's looking." Rebecca smiled gently. "Then show them who you are." That night, as news vans began circling the building and reporters jostled for interviews, Emma sat by the window with the lights off, watching the city glow. Her story was no longer trapped behind the walls of a courtroom or the whispers of betrayal. It was out there, carried by voices far louder than hers alone could have ever been. The world had finally turned its head to look, and for the first time in years, Emma didn't feel forgotten. She felt seen. Rebecca wasn't surprised when Blake Lancaster stormed into her office without an appointment. He didn't knock. He didn't call ahead. He simply pushed past the receptionist with the force of entitlement and the air of a man who believed walls existed to be moved for him. He wore his anger like an expensive suit, pressed and precise, but seething underneath. The door swung, shut behind him with a sharp thud, and for a brief moment, the world outside her glass office seemed to pause. "I hope you know what you've done," Blake said, his voice low but vibrating with restrained fury. Rebecca remained seated, glancing up only long enough to meet his eyes. She didn't flinch. "Please, Mr. Lancaster, do come in." He ignored the sarcasm, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You released a private family video to the press. You violated estate confidentiality. You've destroyed reputations." "Note," Rebecca said, finally folding her hands on the desk. "Your father did that with the truth. I simply helped it find an audience." Blake stopped pacing. He leaned forward over her desk, palms flat on the wood. "We can make this all go away. Quietly, I'm prepared to offer Emma a settlement. 7 figures. She walks away. No more media. No more trials. We rewrite the narrative before it spins further out of control." Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "A bribe, a solution," he snapped. You know as well as I do that court battles like this can drag on for years. It's a mess, for all of us. She can have her money, and we can stop pretending this is about principles." Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and dropped it on the desk between them. The word "declined" was written across it in red ink. "She's not interested," she said. "And neither am I." Blake's face tightened. "This will bury her. The rest of us, our names mean something. We have connections. You can't beat all of us. Not in court. Not in public. People forget the headlines eventually, but legal decisions stick." "You're right," Rebecca said coolly. "And that's exactly why we're not taking your money. We're not looking for a payout. We're looking for a judgment. One that says what you did was wrong." Blake's composure cracked for a split second, just enough for Rebecca to see the desperation behind the fury. Then, like a reflex, he straightened his tie and smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Let me offer you some advice," he said softly. "You're not untouchable. Neither is she." Rebecca narrowed her eyes. Was that a threat? "Call it a warning," he said, already turning toward the door. "People get too bold when they think the public is on their side. But the public is fickle, and accidents happen." She didn't speak again until he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him harder than it had opened. Emma was waiting when Rebecca arrived at the apartment later that evening. She could see it in her face. Fear she was trying to hide, the exhaustion behind her eyes. She'd read the same messages, seen the same warnings, whispered across private emails and anonymous social media accounts, thinly veiled threats, passive mentions of where she lived, even a message that included the name of her caregiver details. No one outside her inner circle should have known. "They're watching me," Emma said quietly. "I don't even know how, but they know things about me, about my building." Rebecca nodded. "They're afraid. That's why they're lashing out, because they're losing control." Emma stared at the window, her reflection faint against the night sky. "It's not just about money for them anymore, is it?" "No," Rebecca said. "It's about legacy. Your father gave them everything, but he gave you the truth, and that's what terrifies them." For the first time in a long time, Emma looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing, but of what her siblings might be willing to do if they realized. They already had Rebecca stood, walking to the door, then locking it with deliberate care. "You're not alone in this. We'll put security in place, a private detail if needed. You will not be intimidated into silence." Emma nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's make sure the next move is ours." The courtroom was packed, more than before. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens poised, their cameras forbidden, but their expressions alert and hungry. Every bench was filled, not just with legal representatives and court staff, but curious citizens who had followed Emma Lancaster's story as it bled from headlines into national conversation. People who once rolled their eyes at what they thought was a petty family feud now leaned forward, waiting for something far more significant, a reckoning. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, quiet, her posture rigid but composed. She wore a dark navy dress, simple and strong. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her features calm. Rebecca sat beside her, papers arranged in a tight, precise stack. But her laptop was open, the file already queued across the aisle. The Lancaster siblings looked less triumphant than they had weeks ago. Heather wore oversized sunglasses, even though the courtroom lights were clinical and unforgiving. Jeremy fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, pale and clearly unwell. Blake, ever the anchor of arrogance, looked only slightly ruffled, but even. He wasn't leaning back with that smug ease anymore. The judge entered, his robe sweeping the floor as he climbed the bench. He adjusted his glasses, surveyed the room, then turned to Rebecca. "You've submitted a motion to present new evidence." Rebecca rose. "Yes, Your Honor. Evidence not previously available due to obstruction and concealment by the defendants." Blake's attorney immediately objected, his voice sharp and rehearsed. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to retry the case in the court of spectacle. We have not verified the authenticity." The judge cut him off with a raised hand. "I've reviewed the motion and accepted the evidence for preliminary viewing. If it fails to meet standards of admissibility, it will be stricken. If not," he turned to Rebecca, "proceed." Rebecca nodded and clicked play. The room fell silent as the screen behind the judge flickered to life. The lights dimmed, just slightly, enough for the footage to cast its weight across every face in the room. Harold Lancaster appeared, seated in that small, dimly lit room, the camera unblinking. His image was grainy but unmistakably real. His voice, though tired, carried through the speakers with a clarity that pierced every corner of the court. If you're watching this, it means my children betrayed my last wishes, and my daughter. Emma deserves the truth. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the reporters in the back audibly whispered, "Oh my God," Harold continued. He spoke of Emma's integrity, how she had discovered the financial fraud Blake had orchestrated. He spoke of Heather's manipulations, Jeremy's complicity, and his own regret. Every line felt deliberate, as if he had rehearsed it 100 times before filming it. The moment he said, "I believed them over Emma, and it was the worst mistake of my life," the air in the courtroom changed. Heather's sunglasses came off, her eyes glassy with panic. Jeremy buried his face in his hands. Blake's jaw locked, his knuckles white on the table edge. The video didn't spare anyone. Harold revealed the unsigned amendment, his intent to rewrite the will, and his belief that someone had been watching him intercepting his attempts. He detailed the second property, the hidden archive, the drive marked with Emma's name. When the screen finally went black, the silence afterward was deafening. Even the judge sat frozen for several seconds, as if stunned by the weight of what he had just seen. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice lower, slower. "This video confirms the plaintiff's claim of will manipulation and reveals an intent on the decedent's part to alter the distribution of assets. This court will now consider these facts in full. The defendants will have the opportunity to respond, but let it be known," he paused, adjusting his glasses again, "that this evidence has changed the context of this entire proceeding." The courtroom erupted, whispers and exclamations. Reporters nearly tripping over one another to exit and broadcast the bombshell. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Order. I will have order in my courtroom." But the damage, or rather, the truth had already been done. Rebecca turned to Emma, who had not moved, her face unreadable. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Emma gave a small nod. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "It's not about being okay. It's about being heard." And finally, after years of being silenced, dismissed, and overlooked, Emma Lancaster had been heard, not just by the court, by everyone. Blake Lancaster took the stand, with the confidence of a man who had spent his life convinced of his own invincibility. He wore a gray suit, tailored within an inch of perfection, and his hair was styled in the same sleek manner he'd sported since business school. His expression, composed and disdainful, barely masked the annoyance of being summoned to explain himself. He glanced once at Emma as he took his seat brief, but loaded with contempt. Rebecca stood slowly from the plaintiff's table, a stack of carefully tabbed documents in her hands. The courtroom had grown quiet again, as it always did during testimony, though the undercurrent of anticipation buzzed like a live wire beneath the silence. "Mr. Lancaster," she began smoothly, "you've previously testified that your father never voiced any intention to change the will. Is that correct?" "Yes," Blake said. "He made his wishes clear years ago. He didn't believe Emma was fit to manage family assets." His words, not mine. Rebecca walked to the evidence screen and tapped a remote. A line of text appeared, Harold's own handwriting. "From the uncovered amendment draft, Emma is the only one who understands stewardship. The others confuse ownership with power." "Do you recognize this?" Rebecca asked. Blake hesitated. "No, this was found in your father's private study," she said. "Filed behind the draft amendment," he typed. "Handwritten notes. All verified. Care to reconsider?" "I never saw it," he said, adjusting his collar. Rebecca walked forward a few paces. "That's interesting, because your signature appears on a memo filed by the estate attorney 2 weeks prior to Harold's stroke, noting a family meeting where will updates were discussed, but discouraged. That's your phrasing, correct?" "Discouraged?" Blake's jaw clenched. "We had a meeting. Yes, we thought he wasn't thinking clearly. He was, getting paranoid. Yet the financial data your father reviewed data, Emma flagged, was accurate, was it not? Wasn't aware of any discrepancies at the time. But you signed off on quarterly earnings, correct? You reviewed the ledgers. I don't manage day-to-day figures," Rebecca turned to the jury. So you ran Lancaster Holdings but took no responsibility for the numbers. I delegated, he snapped. Or manipulated. Blake sat back, visibly bristling, the shine of his composure beginning to dull. The judge raised an eyebrow, noting the shift. Next came Heather. She took the stand with an air of forced detachment, her sunglasses gone but her smile brittle. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word had been polished in a mirror beforehand. My father loved Emma, but he didn't believe she was capable of handling the demands of the foundation. Did he say that to you? Rebecca asked. Not directly, but we all knew how he felt. Rebecca raised a hand. So you inferred his feelings? You assumed? No. He didn't trust her judgment. That was obvious. And yet he wrote in his journals that he regretted trusting you with even the softest responsibilities. Heather's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. Rebecca continued. You claimed Emma was trying to divide the family, that she spread lies about embezzlement. Yet we've now produced documentation and mails between you and your brother authorizing discretionary transfers from the foundation for personal purchases. Do you deny this? I don't recall the specifics, Heather muttered. You purchased a vacation property in Tuscany using charitable funds. I didn't handle the accounting myself. Rebecca turned back to the judge. No further questions. Jeremy was last. Always the least sure, the most malleable. When he took the stand, he looked smaller than ever, folding into himself beneath the courtroom lights. Rebecca was gentler with him. Mr. Lancaster, you attended the same family meeting 2 weeks before your father's hospitalization, correct? Yes, he said quietly. And you recall your father expressing interest in revising the will? Jeremy hesitated. He mentioned it, but Blake told him not to. So you remember that? Jeremy nodded. He said it would upset everything. And when your father died, did you ever question the decision to keep the study sealed? No. I went along with it, because you were afraid, Rebecca asked softly. Jeremy swallowed hard, because I knew they'd turn on me too if I didn't. A hush fell over the room. Rebecca let that hang in the air. She turned back. To the judge, her voice steady, no further questions. As Jeremy stepped down, his eyes flicked to Emma brief, filled with something that could almost have been shame. Emma didn't return the look. She was staring at her lap, unmoving, but her hand, curled over the armrest of her chair, had gone. Still the lies, the excuses, the scaffolding of deceit they had built for years. It was all collapsing now, and they all knew it. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm or after a final breath of silence that knew something irreversible was about to happen. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, Rebecca beside her, both still as the judge rifled through a small stack of papers on his bench. His expression gave nothing away. The gallery behind them was filled to the edges with journalists, court staff, spectators, and somewhere in the back, Gloria Carson, sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap. Across the aisle, Blake leaned forward in his seat, his jaw locked, eyes narrowed, as though he could will the judge to look his way. Heather sat ramrod straight, her lips pressed together in a thin line of denial. Jeremy slumped low in his chair, as if trying to disappear. Beneath the weight of everything unraveling around them, Judge Callahan finally looked up, his face stern but not unkind. He removed his glasses, set them beside the files, and folded his hands. This court has reviewed all submitted evidence. He began, his voice clear and level, including sworn testimony, video documentation, and corroborated financial records. The plaintiff, Emma Lancaster, has made a compelling case that the will presented after Harold Lancaster's death does not accurately reflect his final intentions. A murmur stirred the gallery, quickly silenced by a sharp glance from the judge. In particular, he continued, the court finds sufficient evidence to conclude that the decedent's intent to amend his will was not only genuine, but obstructed by members of his immediate family through undue influence and deliberate interference. Heather's face drained of color. Blake remained motionless, though a small twitch in his temple betrayed the crack in his armor. The submitted draft of the revised estate plan, though unsigned, is supported by contemporaneous journal entries, voice recordings, and credible witness testimony. The video confession recorded by the decedent is especially compelling and consistent with other evidence, and therefore cannot be dismissed as speculative. Judge Callahan's gaze swept the room. In my judgment, the defendants engaged in a pattern of concealment and manipulation that ultimately compromised the integrity of the original will. As such, the court hereby invalidates the contested version in favor of the amendment. Gasps filled the air. Some sharp, others soft. Reporters scribbled furiously, fingers flying over keyboards. The air seemed to shiver around Emma. The amended terms of Harold Lancaster's estate are thus ordered to stand, the judge said. Miss Emma Rose Lancaster is declared the primary heir to Harold Lancaster's estate and shall assume full controlling interest in Lancaster Holdings and the Lancaster Family Foundation. Furthermore, a forensic audit of the Foundation's activities over the past 5 years will be conducted under court supervision. Emma didn't move at first. She sat still, her expression unreadable, absorbing the words as though they were being filtered through a thick fog of disbelief. Beside her, Rebecca exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. She reached out, placing a hand over Emma's. Blake shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," he barked. "You're destroying a legacy over a video and a few pages of unexecuted paperwork." The judge didn't flinch. "You may appeal, Mr. Lancaster, but the decision is final unless overturned. And based on the record before this court, I doubt it will be." Heather turned away, her face pale, eyes glassy. Jeremy remained seated, his hands covering his mouth, staring at nothing. "Court is adjourned," Judge Callahan said, banging his gavel once. The sound echoed through the courtroom. Like a crack of thunder dot, Emma remained in her chair as the room exploded into chaos, reporters calling out, cameras rolling, people rising and falling over themselves for a glimpse of her. She felt Rebecca's hand tighten over hers. "You did it," Rebecca whispered. Emma slowly turned toward her, her voice quiet but resolute. "We did." As they stood, Emma glanced across the room. Blake was already being pulled aside by his attorney, his expression unreadable, but his posture defeated. Heather was gone. Jeremy finally looked at Hurley. Looked hand gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't quite apology, but it wasn't nothing. Outside, the doors swung open and a wall of cameras and microphones waited, but Emma didn't think about the headlines or the legacy or even the money. She thought of her father, sitting in that little hidden room, recording his last truths into a camera, trusting her to carry them forward. And now, the world would finally know them. Not the version twisted by greed or sealed by silence, but the one that mattered. The truth. The verdict sent shockwaves through the country. But nowhere did it land harder than within the fractured walls of the Lancaster family. What had once been whispered rumors about a brewing estate battle exploded into a media firestorm the moment Judge Callahan's ruling was made public. The headlines were brutal, relentless. Heiress wins back legacy in explosive trial. The Lancaster legacy war. Power, lies, and a hidden will. Disinherited siblings crumble under courtroom bombshell. It was front-page news, trending online for days. And at the heart of it all, whether she wanted to be or not, was Emma Lancaster. Emma didn't celebrate the win. There were no parties, no champagne toasts, no self-congratulatory interviews. Instead, she stayed home, unplugged from the noise, and let the world spin without her. Her phone vibrated endlessly calls from journalists, lawyers, old acquaintances who suddenly remembered her number. She answered none of them. The Lancaster estate, once a fortress of polished wood and legacy portraits, now felt like a battlefield, stripped bare. Blake had been the first to react. The very afternoon of the ruling, he held a press conference outside the firm's New York office, flanked by his attorneys. He didn't deny the outcome, but made it clear he didn't accept it. "This is far from over," he declared, his voice tight, his jaw twitching with barely concealed rage. "We are filing an immediate appeal. The ruling is flawed. The so-called evidence was manipulated. My father was not in a sound state of mind when he recorded that video, and we intend to prove it. It was a desperate move, and most analysts knew it. But it wasn't about the appeal, it was about control." Blake had never known how to lose without trying to reshape the loss into something he could live with. Heather, meanwhile, vanished. One day she was spotted at a spa in Connecticut. The next, gone a week after the ruling. Rumors circulated that she'd left the country entirely. Someone caught her boarding a flight to Lisbon under a different name. No statements, no emails, not even a legal filing. She had retreated into silence, perhaps hoping to escape the stain of what had been exposed. Jeremy, to no one's surprise, issued a formal statement through a publicist expressing regret over his involvement in the dispute. He acknowledged the court's decision, praised Emma's resilience, and disappeared from view. Some believed he was sincere. Others called it damage control. Emma didn't know what to believe anymore, and she wasn't sure it mattered. The press dubbed it the Lancaster Legacy War, a title that both sensationalized and trivialized the years of betrayal and heartache that had led to the courtroom showdown. Documentaries were already being pitched. Podcasts scrambled to dissect every detail, each episode filled with dramatic narration and dissected legal minutiae. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Everyone except Emma. She stayed in the small apartment she'd shared with her caregiver, declining offers for interviews and politely refusing invites from talk shows and magazine profiles. Rebecca handled the firm's communications, ensuring that Emma's voice wasn't distorted by media frenzy. Even now, in victory, Emma chose silence. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew what noise did to truth. It diluted it, drowned it. One afternoon, weeks after the ruling, she visited her father's grave for the first time since the funeral. She came alone, no cameras, no entourage. The headstone was simple, gray stone with clean lettering. Harold F. Lancaster, 1949 to 2024. A builder, a father, a man who tried to make it right. She stood there for a long time. "I didn't want it like this," she said softly. "But thank you for seeing me, for trusting me with the truth." There was no answer, only the whisper of wind through the trees. As she turned to leave, Emma felt something shift, not the burden of inheritance or the weight of scandal, but the quiet release of something long denied, dignity. The war might rage on in courtrooms and headlines, but Emma wasn't fighting anymore. She had already won what mattered. The doors of the Lancaster Foundation's main office opened on a rainy Tuesday morning to an entirely different rhythm. Gone were the polished smiles and curated insincerity that once filled its corridors. The air felt lighter, purposeful, as if the very walls had exhaled in relief. After decades of being a tool for vanity projects and high society photo ops, the Foundation was finally being reborn under new hands. Emma's. The first thing she did was clear the boardroom, not physically, but structurally. Every member who had voted in favor of Blake's self-serving philanthropic investments was dismissed. Letters were drafted and delivered with precision, cordial, respectful, but unmistakably final. Some responded with predictable outrage, others with carefully veiled threats cloaked in legal jargon. But it didn't matter. The era of complacent corruption was over. In their place, Emma installed a new generation of advisors and trustees, activists, ethicists, legal advocates, and professionals with lived experience in disability rights. People who had spent their careers not padding portfolios or currying favor at gala dinners, but fighting for access, visibility, and justice. People who didn't just understand the mission, they lived it. She renamed the foundation officially the Lancaster Foundation for Disability Advocacy. The announcement sparked both celebration and scrutiny. The media, ever hungry for drama, tried to paint the rebranding as a PR move, a clever attempt to soften the optics of the courtroom battle. But Emma didn't respond to the noise. She didn't need to. Instead, she focused on action. Within weeks, the foundation launched its first program under her Leadership Pan Education Grant for disabled youth pursuing careers in law, public policy, or social entrepreneurship. Emma had chosen the fields intentionally. It wasn't enough to fund care. She wanted to fund leadership, voices that could advocate, argue, and build. Voices like hers that had once been ignored. Next came the Accessibility Audit Initiative. For years, countless public buildings and corporate campuses had skirted the letter of the law when it came to compliance, hiding behind minimal standards and loopholes. Now the foundation funded third-party audits, offering financial support to bring spaces up to genuine accessibility, not just ramps and elevators, but digital interfaces, training, inclusive signage, and staff education. It wasn't just about entry, it was about dignity. Some companies pushed back, some resisted, but many embraced it. A few even reached out to Emma personally, thanking her for forcing a conversation that had long been overdue. At a press conference that month, her first public appearance since the verdict, Emma rolled onto the stage in a charcoal blazer, her speech brief but resolute. "This isn't about rewriting a legacy," she said, her voice steady. "It's about restoring one. My father made mistakes, but he also made a choice in the end, to entrust me with a foundation that could do more than serve a name. It could serve a purpose. That's what we're doing now." The applause was polite, then passionate. Cameras flashed, hands clapped, but Emma barely acknowledged them. She wasn't there for the show. Later that day, she walked through the foundation offices slowly, nodding to staff she had never met but who now looked at her with something more than recognition. In one of the conference rooms, a young intern paused her meeting just to shake Emma's hand. "My sister's in a chair," the woman said quietly. "What you're doing, it matters. It makes us feel like we belong somewhere." Emma smiled, not the practiced smile from family portraits, but the quiet one that meant something was settling right in her chest. That evening, in the quiet of her apartment, Emma sat with a cup of tea and scrolled through the Foundation's new mission statement, now published on its website: empower, educate, advocate for dignity, for access, for every life that was told to wait its turn. She didn't need a legacy to prove herself anymore. She was building one of her own. The Lancaster estate stood bathed in the soft amber light of early morning. The vast grounds, once symbols of exclusion and grandeur, now felt transformed, quiet, but not silent, purposeful. The hedges were trimmed, the gardens blooming again, not with exotic flowers imported from other continents, but native plants, chosen for their resilience. The heavy, gilded front gates had been replaced with ironwork, designed by a local artist, open, welcoming, unpretentious. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. The fortress was no longer meant to keep people out. Emma wheeled slowly across the graveled path, her fingers grazing the edge of a newly planted olive tree just outside the west wing. It had been her father's favorite tree, one he'd spoken about bringing here but never had. Now it stood tall, rooted deeply, its leaves catching the morning breeze. Beside her stood Rebecca, arms crossed lightly, sunglasses perched on her head. The two women had walked these grounds before, but not like this, not as victors, not as builders. "You did it," Rebecca said, her voice soft but proud. Emma gave a small smile. "We did." They walked together, or rather, Emma rolled slowly as Rebecca kept pace beside her. There was no urgency, no press of time. For the first time in what felt like years, the weight of expectation had lifted. The house no longer loomed like a monument to betrayal. It stood as something else, now history reclaimed, truth remembered. Rebecca paused as they neared the front steps, her eyes scanning the stately building. "I still remember the first time I came here. I thought, God, how can one family live in something so big?" Emma laughed, a quiet sound, genuine and warm. "You should have seen the inside during the holidays. It felt even bigger when no one was talking to each other." Rebecca's gaze drifted upward to the windows. "It's funny, isn't it? All that power, all that space, and still, they couldn't make room for you." Emma looked down for a moment, her fingers curling around the rim of her wheels. "They didn't have to. I made space for myself." Rebecca turned to her, her voice steady and firm. "You were never the weak one, Emma. You understand that, right? They weren't afraid of your disability. They were afraid of your strength, because you saw what they refused to, because you didn't need them to validate you." Emma didn't speak right away. The wind rustled the trees, the sound soft and rhythmic, like breath. "I think," Emma finally said, "they wanted to believe the lie so badly they convinced themselves it was true. That I was fragile. That I couldn't carry the weight of the name or the legacy. But I never needed to carry it alone. I just needed to make it honest." They stood in silence for a few minutes, watching as a small team of workers arrived near the rear gardens. Volunteers, most of them, from organizations the newly restructured foundation supported. They were building an outdoor learning center, one of many planned projects on the estate grounds. "I don't want this place to be about them anymore," Emma said quietly. "I want it to be about possibility, about what happens when someone refuses to be erased." Rebecca nodded. "Then you're already succeeding." They began walking again, moving toward the main door. The new brass handle gleamed in the sunlight, polished but not gaudy. Inside, the rooms had been cleared of portraits and polished plaques. The halls were lined instead with photographs of foundation events, artwork from disabled artists, letters from people whose lives had been changed by the grants and programs, now flourishing under Emma's leadership. As they stepped into the foyer, Emma paused one last time to look over her shoulder at the estate, now cast in full daylight. "This isn't my ending," she said. "It's just the beginning." Rebecca smiled and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then, let's begin." The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the laptop fan and the distant chirping of birds beyond the window pane. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, casting soft shadows across the hardwood floor. Emma sat alone in her father's old study, now her surrounded by the things he once held dear. The bookshelves lined with volumes of law and history, the old leather armchair that still bore the imprint of his presence, and the sturdy oak desk where so many decisions had once been made. The screen before her flickered gently, already halfway. Through the familiar video, she'd watched it before. Many times, sometimes in silence, sometimes with Rebecca nearby, sometimes through the numb haze of disbelief and grief. But today felt different. Today, she watched it not because she needed answers or proof or validation. She watched it because she could. Harold's image on the screen was steady, his voice calm but earnest. The weight of regret etched into the lines around his eyes didn't sting as sharply as it once had. Now it seemed to soften him, to reveal a man who had finally understood the truth too late, but still acted, still left something behind to be righted. "I know you're probably angry with me," he was saying, "and you have every right to be. I spent too long trusting those who wanted to silence you and not nearly enough time listening to the daughter, who never asked for anything but the truth. But know this, I see you now. I always did, even if I didn't admit it." Emma leaned back slightly, the armrest cool under her fingers. She didn't cry at those words anymore. Not in the way she had the first time, with the kind of tears that come from long-buried wounds ripped open. Now, the emotion that rose in her was quieter, not pain, not loss, but something closer to gratitude. On-screen Harold shifted slightly, leaning forward. "You always were the best of them, Emma. You never had to prove it. I just had to remember it, and I'm sorry it took me so long." A single tear slipped down Emma's cheek before she could stop it. She reached for a tissue and wiped it away with quiet grace. No drama, no collapse. It was just a release brief, sincere and earned. The video ended, the screen fading to black with a soft click. She closed the laptop gently, resting her palm on the lid for a moment, as if sealing away the last chapter of something sacred. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of everything they'd been through. The lies, the isolation, the courtroom, the shift, the restoration. Outside, she could hear the subtle buzz of life picking up again. She knew they were there, journalists waiting by the gate, vans idling along the estate's drive. More interviews to request, more headlines to write, even after the verdict. The world hadn't finished with her, but the difference now was simple. She was ready. She wheeled herself toward the open balcony doors, letting the warm breeze wrap around her like a shawl. Down below, the press waited, cameras lifted like metallic eyes, always watching. For months, they had painted her as bitter, broken, a symbol of scandal. Then, suddenly, as an underdog hero, a woman wronged, reclaiming her throne. But Emma had never needed a throne, just a voice, and the space to be heard. She looked out over the lawn, the olive trees standing proud in the distance, and let her breath ease. They could ask their questions. They could tell her story however they pleased, but she had already told her own. Court, in truth, in action. Her father's voice still echoed in her mind. You always were the best of them. And now, as she turned toward the doors, chin lifted, heart steady, it was clear Ma Lancaster didn't need revenge. She didn't need applause. She had the last laugh, and it was quiet, strong, and hers alone.